Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. I always assumed the stories people tell are just exaggerated accounts of real-life creepiness. That changed last week. I work part-time at a small, family-owned antique shop in my town. It's not a glamorous job, but I like the quiet, and the old items have a charm I've grown fond of. The shop is tucked into a corner of a cobblestone street that sees very little foot traffic, especially after dark. Last Friday, my boss, Mrs. Hartley, asked if I could close up. She had a family emergency and promised me a nice bonus if I stayed late. It seemed simple enough. Lock the doors, check the register, turn off the lights. I'd done it before, so I didn't think twice. The trouble started around 9 p.m., just as I was finishing the final sweep of the store. The bell above the door jingled. I froze because I had locked it an hour earlier. "Sorry, we're closed." I called out, my voice wobbling. No reply. I stepped out from behind the counter to see who had entered, but the store was empty. The door was shut, locked just as I'd left it. The bell swayed gently, as though someone had passed through, but no one was there. I laughed nervously to myself and chalked it up to my imagination. This place was old. Maybe the door wasn't as secure as I thought. I double-checked the lock and went back to tidying. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the old grandfather clock in the corner. It ticks loudly, and its groaning mechanism has spooked me before. But this wasn't ticking. It was a soft, raspy whisper like someone murmuring just below their breath. I followed the sound through the maze of shelves, past dusty books and porcelain dolls. It led me to the far back of the store, where Mrs. Hartley kept the older, rare items. The whisper stopped as soon as I reached the section. I turned to leave when a loud crash shattered the silence. A gilded mirror had fallen off the wall, landing face up on the floor. Its glass was intact, but my reflection wasn't. In the mirror, I saw myself, pale and wide-eyed, but there was something behind me, a figure cloaked in shadow, standing just over my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. I didn't wait to investigate further. I grabbed my bag, left the mess for the morning, and bolted for the door. As I fumbled with the keys, I heard it again, a whisper clear as day this time. "Don't leave me. I've never locked a door faster in my life." The next morning, I told Mrs. Hartley about what happened. She laughed it off, saying the shop had a history of odd occurrences but nothing harmful. That didn't comfort me. I quit on the spot. A week later, I was walking past the store when I noticed something that stopped me cold. In the display window, among the vintage knickknacks and antique furniture, was the gilded mirror. After seeing the shadowy figure in the window, I started avoiding that street altogether. The antique shop wasn't far from where I lived, but I found excuses to take longer routes just to avoid it. A small price to pay for peace of mind, I thought, but the unease didn't stop. It began with my dreams. Every night, I'd find myself back in the store. The aisles stretched endlessly, shelves bending and twisting in impossible ways. No matter how far I walked, I'd always end up in front of the mirror. The reflection wasn't mine, though. It was its. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the whisper still echoing in my ears. "Don't leave me." One morning, after another restless night, I found something waiting for me on my doorstep, a small, ornate box. I didn't own anything like it, and the way it was wrapped, perfectly tied with a thin black ribbon, made it clear this wasn't some random delivery mistake. Against my better judgment, I brought it inside. The box smelled faintly of lavender and dust, like the antique shop. Inside was a bundle of old photographs, the kind you'd find in a flea market. They were faded, edges curled, but the faces were disturbingly clear. At first, I didn't recognize anyone in the photos, just solemn-faced people in old-fashioned clothing, posing stiffly for the camera. But then I saw it. The shadowy figure. It was in the background of every photo. Sometimes it stood at a doorway, other times in a window. In one picture, it loomed directly behind a family seated for a portrait. I flipped through the images faster and faster, my heart racing. The last photo stopped me cold. It was May. I was standing in the antique shop, behind the counter, just like I had a week ago. But the shadow wasn't behind me, it was beside me, its hand resting on my shoulder like we were old friends. I threw the box across the room, scattering the photographs everywhere. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but what would I say? That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat in my living room with every light on, clutching a kitchen knife like it would do any good. The hours crawled by, and just as dawn began to creep through the blinds, I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was different. Closer. "Why did you leave me?" The room turned ice cold. The knife slipped from my trembling hands as I looked toward the source of the voice. The gilded mirror from the shop was propped against my wall. I hadn't brought it here. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't mine. Its eyes were wrong, dull, empty, and black as the void. The shadowy figure stood behind it, and this time, it stepped forward. I don't remember screaming, but my neighbors told me they heard it. When the police arrived, I was curled in a corner, rocking back and forth. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces around me. They asked if I wanted to press charges, but against who? What could I say? The mirror was gone when I went back to my apartment. So were the photographs. I've moved since then, far away from that town, from that shop, from anything that could remind me of what happened. But sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I swear I see the shadow. For a while, things were quiet. I kept telling myself it was over. I moved across the country to a new city, changed my phone number, deleted my social media accounts, and even legally changed my name. I wanted nothing left of my old life to track me down, but I guess some things don't care about borders or names. The first sign came a few weeks ago. I was unpacking a box of kitchenware in my new apartment. It was the last box, one I knew I hadn't packed carefully because I'd been in such a rush to leave. I pulled out plates, mugs, a whisk, and then, at the very bottom, an old photograph. It wasn't mine. I recognized it immediately. It was one of the pictures from the box I'd found on my doorstep, the one with the shadowy figure standing in the background. My hand started to shake so badly I dropped it, the photo landing face up on the floor. I thought I'd destroyed everything, burned the photos, smashed the mirror, but here it was. And worse, this time the shadowy figure wasn't standing in the background. It was closer, almost reaching the edge of the frame. I threw the photo in the trash and took the entire bag out to the dumpster that night. I thought it was over. A few days later, my upstairs neighbor knocked on my door. She was a sweet older woman, the type who bakes cookies for new tenants. But today, she wasn't smiling. "Sorry to bother you," she said hesitantly, "but do you have someone staying with you?" "No," I said, confused. "Why?" Her face paled. "I could have sworn I saw someone in your apartment last night. Tall, wearing black. They were standing by your window, just staring out." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I forced a weak smile. "Oh, no, it's just me. Maybe it was a shadow or something." She nodded, clearly unconvinced, and left. That night, I stayed awake again, every light on. I told myself she was mistaken, but deep down, I knew better. The next day, I decided to install security cameras in my apartment. It was an impulsive decision, but I wanted proof. I set one up in the living room, another in the hallway, and the last in my bedroom. I didn't really expect to catch anything. I wish I hadn't. The footage from the first night was mostly uneventful. Me pacing back and forth, sitting on the couch, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. But around 3 a.m., the living room camera picked up movement. A shadow. It wasn't clear at first, just a flicker near the edge of the frame. But then it moved. It stepped into view, tall and thin, its form hazy like smoke. It didn't have a face, just an unsettling blankness where one should be. It stood there for hours, motionless, staring at the bedroom door. My bedroom door. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called a priest, a psychic, anyone I thought might help. Most of them didn't take me seriously, and the ones who did just gave me vague advice about cleansing my space or protecting my energy. I tried everything they suggested: sage, salt, prayers, even burning candles. Nothing worked. The thing didn't leave. Last night, I reached my breaking point. I packed a bag and decided to leave again, but as I opened the door to leave, I froze. There, propped against the wall in my hallway, was the gilded mirror, the same one I destroyed back at the antique shop. Its surface was cracked, spiderweb fractures splitting across the glass. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't alone. The shadow was there, its hand pressed against the glass as if it were trying to step through. And then, for the first time, it spoke. "You can't run." I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up on the floor, my bag still by the door. The mirror was gone, and I'm writing this from a motel, miles away from my apartment. I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. It always does. If you ever come across a gilded mirror in an antique shop, or anywhere, please, for your own sake, walk away. A few years ago, I worked as a freelance photographer, and one of my clients was a quirky artist named Marisol. She painted abstract pieces that were either mesmerizing or unsettling, depending on your perspective. She rented this old attic studio in a historic part of town, a building that had been a boarding house in the late 1800s. The place had character, with creaky wooden floors, arched windows, and beams so low you had to duck in places. It was the kind of spot you'd see in a movie and think, wow, what a cool space. But in person, it felt heavy. Marisol Marisol had hired me to take photos of her latest series for a gallery submission. The first time I walked in, I immediately noticed the odd smell. It wasn't overpowering, but it lingered, a mix of damp wood and something metallic. I chalked it up to the age of the building and didn't think much of it. Marisol was a little eccentric, but she paid well, so I agreed to shoot her work over a couple of afternoons. On the second day, I was alone in the studio while Marisol ran to grab us coffee. The light was dim because the weather had turned gloomy, and the small desk lamp she left on wasn't cutting it. I decided to move the lamp closer to the canvas I was photographing. That's when I heard it, a faint sound like someone whispering. I froze and listened. Nothing, just the sound of rain starting to tap against the windows. I shook it off and went back to work, but a few minutes later, there it was again. This time, it was clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. It wasn't coming from the windows or the hallway. It was coming from the floor. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the wood. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging against a chalkboard, but muffled. My stomach turned, and I shot to my feet just as Marisol walked back in, coffee in hand. "You okay?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I just nodded and mumbled something about the storm making weird noises. She seemed satisfied and went back to work on a canvas in the corner. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often, I'd catch Marisol glancing over her shoulder like she'd heard something too. Finally, as I was packing up my gear, I decided to ask her about it. "Hey, do you ever hear strange things in her?" She paused, her paintbrush hovering mid-air. "What kind of strange things?" "Like whispering or scraping." Her face went pale. She set the brush down and gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, that's just the building settling. It's old. Creaks and groans all the time," and her words didn't match the way her hands were trembling. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sounds in my head, trying to rationalize them. The next morning, I got a text from Marisol. "Hey, can we reschedule?" Something came up. I didn't hear from her for weeks after that. When she finally reached out, it was to ask if I still had the photos. She wanted to submit them to the gallery because she wasn't going back to the studio. She wouldn't say why, and I didn't push her. I sent her the files and decided to drop the whole thing. A few months later, I ran into another artist who used to rent a space in the same building. I casually mentioned Marisol's studio, and his face darkened. "You didn't hear," he said. "They found a hidden crawl space under the floorboards in that attic. The police think it was used to hide people or bodies. The one knows for sure." After hearing that chilly revelation from the other artist, I couldn't get it out of my head. The crawl space under the floorboards, used for what exactly? I wanted to forget about it, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear those whispers again. I told myself it was just my imagination and old building making weird noises. That's all it was, right? A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to drive past the building just to see if it was still in use. When I got there, the place was eerily quiet. A for-lease sign hung crookedly in one of the lower windows. The attic lights were off, but my mind filled in the memory of the dim glow from Marisol's desk lamp. I almost drove away, but something made me park and get out. Standing in front of the building, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your instincts scream at you to leave. But instead of listening, I walked up the steps and peered through the window on the main floor. The interior looked abandoned, with dust covering the wooden floors and debris scattered around. There was no sign of anyone, but I swear I could feel eyes on me. I backed away quickly, heart pounding, and almost tripped on the cracked pavement. As I turned to leave, I noticed a faint outline of what looked like a child's handprint smudged on the glass. It was too high up to belong to an actual child. I told myself it had to be some kind of prank, leftovers from when the place was still occupied. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I had the worst dream of my life. I was back in the studio, standing over the spot where I'd heard the whispering. In the dream, the floorboards were loose, and I could see a dark gap underneath. As I bent down to look closer, cold, pale hands shot out and grabbed my wrists, pulling me toward the opening. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The next day, I got a text from Marisol. It was strange because we hadn't spoken since I sent her the photos. Her message was short and cryptic: "Stay away from the building. It knows you." I stared at my phone, heart racing. I texted her back, demanding an explanation, but she didn't reply. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. The whole thing felt like a bad joke, but her warning stuck with me. A week later, I heard through the grapevine that the building was slated for demolition. Apparently, the owners had decided it wasn't worth the hassle of trying to rake it out anymore. I felt a twisted sense of relief, safe, thinking maybe whatever was in there would finally be gone for good. The night before the demolition, I had another dream. This time, I was outside the building, watching as a wrecking ball swung into the attic. The walls crumbled, revealing not just the crawl space, but something worse. There were faces, pale, sunken faces, pressed against the inside of the walls, mouths open in silent screams. They weren't just in the crawl space, they were part of the building. I woke up gasping, my chest tight with terror. The next day, I checked the news, hoping to see an article about the demolition, but there was nothing. I searched online, but the only mention of the building was a small forum post from someone who claimed they'd heard whispers coming from the rubble after it had been torn down. I've tried to move on, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the whispering again. It's faint, like it's coming from the floor beneath me. I tell myself it's just my imagination. I keep telling myself that, but I don't think I really believe it. The whispers didn't stop after that night. They weren't constant, but every now and then, in the dead of night, I'd hear them soft and unintelligible, almost like they were coming from somewhere far away. I told myself it was nothing, old pipes, a draft, or maybe just the echoes of my overactive imagination. But the more I ignored it, the more persistent it became. One evening, I came home to find my bedroom door ajar. I live alone, and I was certain I'd shut it that morning. My heart started pounding as I slowly pushed the door open. Everything seemed normal at first glance. My bed was made, my things were exactly where I left them. But when I turned to leave, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There was a smudge on the inside of my window, a faint handprint, almost identical to the one I'd seen on the glass at the building. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape, no balcony, no way someone could have reached the window from outside. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I thought about calling someone, a friend, the police, anyone, but what would I say? Hey, I think I'm being haunted by a whispering attic. I'd sound insane. The next day, I decided to dig deeper into the building's history. I spent hours scouring local archives and old newspapers. What I found made my blood run cold. In the late 1800 seconds, the building had been a boarding house, just as I'd heard. But what I didn't know was that it had a dark reputation. Several tenants had gone missing over the years, their disappearances never solved. One article mentioned rumors of a secret space beneath the attic, where some believed the landlord had hidden the bodies. The story didn't end there. Decades later, the building was turned into an art studio. Multiple artists complained of hearing strange noises, whispers, footsteps, even the sound of breathing when no one else was around. One artist, a sculptor, reported finding small, childlike handprints pressed into the wet clay of her unfinished work. She moved out the next day. I felt sick reading this. It was as if the building had absorbed all the fear and pain of those who had disappeared, and now it seemed to have followed me. That night, I was determined to stay awake. I sat on my couch, every light in the apartment blazing, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Around 3 a.m., the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but they were closer, almost like they were coming from just behind the walls. Then, the scraping began. It sounded like nails dragging across wood, coming from the floor under my feet. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but before I could dial, the lights flickered and went out. The whispers stopped. The apartment was silent, oppressively silent. I sat there in the darkness, phone clenched in my hand, too terrified to move. And then I felt it, a cold, gentle breath against the back of my neck. I ran out of the apartment without looking back. I didn't care that I was barefoot or that it was the middle of the night. I just kept running until I reached my car. I drove to a friend's house and spent the night on their couch, shaking and unable to explain what had happened. I moved out the next week. I didn't go back for most of my things. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that apartment again. I've tried to start over, to put it all behind me. I used to run track and cross country, so training runs were part of my routine. Our town had a bike path that ran for miles, cutting through the outskirts and dipping into an older, industrial area. It wasn't the safest part of town, but it was broad daylight, and I was with my friend Jesse. We figured we'd be fine. The path eventually narrowed into a tunnel that passed under an old overpass. It wasn't particularly long, but it always gave me a weird feeling, like I was being watched. The walls were covered in graffiti, and sometimes you'd see broken glass or beer bottles. People joked it was a hobo hangout, but I'd never seen anyone there before. That day, Jesse and I reached the tunnel just as the wind picked up and clouds rolled in, making it a bit darker than usual. I slowed down, instinctively cautious, but Jessie rolled her eyes. "It's just a tunnel," she said, jogging ahead. I followed her in, the sound of our shoes echoing in the confined space. Halfway through, I heard it, a sharp scrape, like metal on concrete. It wasn't us, we were moving too smoothly. They stopped. Jessie stopped too, turning back to me. "What?" she asked, irritated. "Did you hear that?" it? I whispered. We both stood still, and then we heard it again, this time louder. Scrape, dragon, scrape, dragon. It came from deeper in the tunnel, from the shadows we hadn't yet reached. Jessie's confidence faltered. Probably just a squirrel or something, she muttered, but I could tell she didn't believe it. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart pounding. Jessie stayed behind me, gripping my arm. As we moved closer, the sound stopped. Silent. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Then, out of nowhere, a voice. Low, raspy, and sing-song. Don't stop now. You're almost here. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. Jessie let out a small scream and started pulling me backward, but I couldn't move. The voice came again, louder this time, so close. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I saw him. A man crouched against the wall, almost blending into the graffiti. He was filthy, his clothes hanging off him in rags, and his head was cocked at an unnatural angle. He held a long metal pipe, the end of it jagged and rusted. He smiled at me, a grin too wide to be human. Rud, Jessie screamed, yanking me so hard that I stumbled. The man stood up in one fluid motion, taller than I expected, and took a step toward us. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted out of the tunnel, sprinting back the way we came. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him running after us, his heavy footsteps pounding on the concrete. He was fast, faster than anyone should have been. We didn't stop until we were back in the open, where other runners and cyclists were passing by. Only then did I look back. The tunnel was empty. We told the police, but they didn't find anyone. The officer who took our statement said there had been reports of someone harassing people on the bike path, but nothing this extreme. I never ran there again. Jessie moved away a year later, and we don't talk about it anymore. For weeks after the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every creak in my house, every shadow outside my window made my heart race. My parents brushed it off as paranoia, and maybe they were right, but Jessie and I both knew what we'd seen and heard wasn't normal. About a month later, Jessie called me out of the blue. She sounded panicked, her words spilling out so quickly I could barely understand her. "Sir, I swear it's him. Slow down," I said, my stomach tightening. "What do you mean?" "I'm staying with my cousin for the weekend," she said, her voice trembling. We were walking to the corner store, and I saw him. He was just standing there, at the edge of the parking lot, staring at me. I didn't know what to say. The idea that this man had somehow found Jessie, miles from where we'd seen him, was too much to process. "Did he do anything?" I asked. "No, but," she cut herself off. "I just know it was him. That smell. I can't forget it." I tried to calm her down, but honestly, I wasn't sure what to believe. Was it possible he'd followed her, or was her mind playing tricks on her like mine had been doing? The next day, I got a text from Jessie. He was outside my cousin's house last night. I'm going home early. I called her immediately, but she didn't pick up. That was the last I heard from her for weeks. When I finally got through, she was distant, brushing off my questions and saying everything was fine, but I could tell it wasn't. Meanwhile, strange things started happening to me too. It started small. Footsteps behind me when I walked home from school, though no one was there when I turned around. My dog, Max, would growl at the window at night, staring at something I couldn't see. Once, I found the back gate to our yard wide open, though I was sure I'd locked it. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. It was faint, like fingernails on glass. My heart leapt into my throat. My bedroom was on the second floor. I stayed frozen in bed, too scared to move. The tapping stopped, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then I heard it, a voice, low and raspy, coming from outside. "Don't stop now. You're almost here." My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering to the operator what was happening. They said they'd send someone, but by the time the officers arrived, there was no sign of anyone outside. No footprints in the dirt below my window. Nothing. The police didn't take me seriously. They chalked it up to a prank or a bad dream. My parents didn't believe me either, but I knew. It was him. Jessie and I eventually drifted apart, but I heard through mutual friends that she moved states not long after high school. I can't say I blame her. As for me, I stopped running. I stopped going anywhere alone, and I never ever walked by tunnels. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the faint sound of tapping, followed by that voice. Years passed, but the fear never fully went away. I moved to a different town for college, started a new life, and did my best to bury the memories. Jessie and I lost touch entirely, and I convinced myself that whatever happened back then was over. For a while, it worked. I even started running again, sticking to well-lit parks and avoiding anything that felt remotely isolated. But the paranoia never never left me completely. I always carried pepper spray, kept my earbuds out, and made sure someone knew where I was going. Then, during my junior year of college, it happened again. It was late autumn, and the days were getting shorter. I had an evening class that ran until 7 p.m., and by the time I walked out of the building, it was already dark. The campus was mostly empty, but I figured it wasn't a big deal. I made the walk back to my dorm 100 times before. I was about halfway there when I noticed something. It sounded faint at first, like distant footsteps, but as I kept walking, it grew louder. It wasn't steady, though. It had that same uneven rhythm I'd heard all those years ago. Scrape, dragon, scrape, dragon. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Slowly, I turned around. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty sidewalk and the faint glow of a street lamp in the distance. But then I spotted him. He was standing at the edge of the light, half hidden in shadow, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. His grin was the same, too wide and too eager, and in his hand was something long and metallic, a pipe, or maybe a crowbar. I couldn't tell. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He took a step forward, the scrape of his weapon on the pavement echoing in the quiet. "Don't stop now," he rasped, his voice cutting through the cold night air. "You're almost here." That snapped me out of it. I turned and bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My dorm was only a few blocks away, and I prayed I'd make it before he caught up to me. When I reached the building, I slammed the door shut behind me and collapsed against it, gasping for air. The security guard at the front desk stared at me, alarmed, but I couldn't explain what had happened. My mind was spinning, my body trembling. I finally managed to choke out, "There's a man outside." The guard grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but of course, by the time he got there, the man was gone. I stayed locked in my room for the rest of the night, shaky with fear and trying to make sense of it all. But the worst part, the next morning, when I finally worked up the courage to leave my room, I found something waiting for me. On the floor outside my door was a piece of paper. It had one word scrawled across it in shaky, uneven letters: soon. I moved out of that dorm by the end of the week, transferring to a different campus across the state. I changed my number, deleted my social media, and made sure no one could find me. I work part-time at an aquatic center, mostly handling maintenance shifts after hours. It's a quiet gig, and honestly, I enjoy the solitude. The pool after dark has this calm, echoey vibe that feels like being inside a giant seashell. One night, I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something odd. The water level in the main pool was lower than usual. Nothing drastic, maybe an inch or two, but it was noticeable. It didn't make sense since the pumps and filters had been fine earlier. I figured it was just a glitch and went to check the filtration room. That's when I saw it. At the bottom of the pool, where the main drain usually is, was a staircase. It spiraled down into what looked like complete darkness. I froze, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. There had never been stairs there before. I'd cleaned this pool countless times. I knew every tile, every crack. Against my better judgment, I leaned over the edge to get a closer look. The water rippled faintly, almost as if something was moving down there. I told myself it was just the pool's filtration system kicking on, but my gut was screaming that it wasn't. I radioed my coworker, Mark, who was in the office. When I described what I was seeing, he laughed and told me to stop messing around. "Stairs in the pool." "Yeah, okay, buddy," he said. Frustrated, I decided to prove it to them. I grabbed a flashlight and dipped it into the water. The beam barely penetrated the darkness below the staircase. I couldn't see the bottom. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed the pool's long net pole. I poked it toward the stairs, and the moment it touched them, I swear I felt a pull, like something was trying to yank the pole out of my hands. I dropped the pole and stumbled back. The water turned, and I could hear it sloshing even though I wasn't touching it anymore. Then I heard a sound I'll never forget, a low, guttural groan, like metal grinding against metal, but alive. It reverberated through the whole pool area. I bolted to the office and dragged Mark out to sea. Of course, by the time we got back, the water was completely still. No stairs, no strange noises, just the usual main drain, sitting there like nothing had ever happened. Mark gave me endless grief about it, calling me paranoid and tired, but I knew what I saw. I refused to work another night shift after that. A week later, I quit altogether. It's been a couple of months since I left that job, but the dreams haven't stopped. They're getting worse. At first, it was just me staring down at the staircase. Now, in the dreams, I'm standing on the stairs. The water feels thick and heavy, like I'm wading through syrup, but I'm always moving down, step by step. I never see the bottom, but I know something is waiting for me there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild, but last week, I woke up with my feet soaking wet. My bedroom was dry, and there was no explanation. skeleton. My shoes, socks, everything was bone dry too. Just my feet, soaked to the skin. That's when I started digging. I needed answers. I looked up the aquatic center's history and found something unsettling. Decades ago, before it became a pool, the building was part of a larger facility, a hospital to be exact. Specifically, it was a mental institution with a reputation for less than ethical practices. The pool area had been part of the basement where the institution kept its most difficult patients. I couldn't find many details, but I did come across an old newspaper article about a massive flood that destroyed part of the hospital. The basement was completely submerged, and several patients and staff were never found. The article mentioned a structural anomaly in the floor that might have contributed to the collapse, but it was vague. It stuck with me, though. What kind of anomaly could cause a flood like that? Despite my fear, I had to go back to the pool. Not officially, I wasn't about to ask for my old job back. Instead, I decided to sneak in after hours. It wasn't hard, the security system was outdated, and I still remembered the codes. The place was eerily quiet at night, just like I remembered. The smell of chlorine hung in the air, and my footsteps echoed across the tile. I made my way to the maid pool, heart pounding. It looked normal, calm, still water reflecting the dim emergency lights. For a moment, I thought I was crazy. Then I saw the ripples. They started in the center of the pool, faint at first but growing stronger. The staircase appeared again, slowly materializing out of the darkness below. My breath caught in my throat. This time, it wasn't empty. Something was coming up the stairs. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could hear it. The same grinding, guttural sound from before, but louder, angrier. The water swirled violently, splashing onto the deck as whatever it was climbed higher. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the parking lot. When I looked back, the building was completely dark, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to come back. That was 2 nights ago. I haven't told anyone, not even my family, who would believe me, but I think it knows where I live. Last night, I woke up to the sound of dripping water. My bedroom floor was soaked, and there were wet footprints leading from my bed to the door. They weren't mine. They were too big, and they were still wet. I didn't sleep last night. Every sound, every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I barricaded the door to my bedroom with a chair and stayed up with the lights on. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was some lingering nightmare or hallucination. But the soaked footprints were real. The water on the floor was real. Whatever was in the pool had followed me home. Today, I decided to call Mark. He might have thought I was messing around before, but I needed him to believe me now. I was shaking when I dialed his number, rehearsing how I'd explain everything without sounding insane. But when he picked up, I barely got 2 words out before he interrupted me. "Dude," he said, his voice tense. "I was going to call you. Something weird is happening at the pool." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "There was an accident last night," Mark said. "A lifeguard stayed late to finish up some paperwork. The cameras showed him going into the pool area around midnight, but ... he never came out. I felt like the floor had been yanked out from under me." "Did they find him?" "Sort of." Mark hesitated. "The morning crew found his shoes and clothes near the edge of the pool. No sign of him, though. They drained the pool this morning to look for him, but what? There was no water in the pool." Mark whispered, "No, just the staircase. And they don't go down there. No one does." My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. "Mark, listen to me. You have to get out of there. Whatever is down there, it's not safe. It's not just a pool, it's, I don't know, some kind of gateway. Mark sounded skeptical, but there was fear in his voice, too. "Look, man, I don't know what's going on, but I'm not sticking around to find out. I already gave my notice this morning." "Good," I said. "Stay away from that place. Promise me." He promised, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not for me. Not for anyone who had been there. Whatever was beneath the pool wasn't going to stay contained. That night, the dreams came back, but this time they were different. I wasn't alone. I saw the lifeguard, his face pale and distorted, standing at the bottom of the stairs. His eyes were wide with terror, and his mouth moved like he was trying to scream, but no sound came out. Behind him, the shadows twisted and writhed, forming something massive. Something with too many arms. When I woke up, I could still hear the faint echoes of splashing water. My window was open, and the smell of chlorine filled the room. This morning, I checked the news. The aquatic center is closed indefinitely due to structural concerns. No mention of the lifeguard. No mention of the staircase. It's like they're trying to erase it, pretend it never happened. But I know better. The staircase is still there, waiting. And I have this horrible feeling that it's not done with me. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. The water, the stairs, the thing lurking in the darkness. I don't know how to stop it. I don't even know if it can be stopped. All I know is that if it comes for me, I'll do whatever it takes to keep it from finding anyone else. I was driving across the country to visit my family for the holidays. It was late at night, around 11:30 p.m., and I was somewhere in the middle of Nebraska on a desolate stretch of the interstate. There were no cars, no streetlights, just me, the road, and an unsettling amount of darkness. I was getting drowsy, and my GPS told me there was a rest stop coming up. I figured I'd pull in, use the bathroom, and maybe grab a few minutes of sleep in my car. As I approached, I noticed how isolated it was. The rest stop sat slightly off the interstate, surrounded by flat fields that seemed to stretch forever. A single flickering light over the parking lot greeted me as I pulled in. The place looked run down but not abandoned. There were a couple of cars parked in the lot, though I didn't see anyone around. I parked near the building and made my way inside. The restroom area was dimly lit and smelled like damp concrete. I was alone, or so I thought. I was washing my hands when I heard faint humming coming from one of the stalls. It was soft, almost melodic, and definitely unsettling. I hadn't noticed anyone else come in, and the place had been dead quiet when I entered. "Hello," I called out, trying to mask the nervous shake in my voice. The humming stopped. I waited for a reply, but none came. I dried my hands quickly and turned to leave when I noticed something that froze me in place. There was a pair of shoes visible under one of the stall doors. Men's shoes, old and scuffed, but they were facing the wrong way. The toes were pointed toward the toilet, as if whoever was in there was standing on it, watching me. My heart started pounding. I debated just running out of there, but something compelled me to glance back one more time. That's when I saw the shoes slide, not step, not shuffle, slide slowly across the floor toward the gap under the door. I bolted out of the bathroom and ran straight to my car, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I struggled to start the engine. As I fumbled with the keys, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A figure was standing just outside the restroom building, partially obscured by the flickering light. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at my direction. I couldn't make out any features, but something about their posture, too rigid, too unnatural, made my skin crawl. I finally got the car started and sped out of there without looking back. For the rest of my drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every now and then, I'd glance at my mirrors, half expecting to see that figure again. I've told this story a few times, and some people think I imagined it or let my nerves get the better of me, but I knew what I saw. I've avoided rest stops ever since and always make sure to keep driving, no matter how tired I get. For years, I thought I could put that experience behind me. I told myself it was just a creepy encounter, something I could chalk up to exhaustion or paranoia. But a few weeks ago, something happened that made me realize I might never escape whatever I encountered that night. It started with an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Rest Stop Memories." I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but curiosity got the better of me. The email was short, just one sentence. "Do you remember the shoes?" My stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone about the shoes. Not the way they slid across the floor, not the way they were facing. I only ever mentioned the figure outside, the weird humming, and the unease I felt. My fingers hovered over my keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. I marked it as spam and tried to brush it off. The next few days, things started to get strange. At night, I'd hear faint humming outside my apartment. It wasn't constant, just a few notes, barely audible. Every time I got up to look out the window, the street would be empty. Then, one night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It wasn't on the front door or the windows, it was coming from my bathroom. My heart started racing as memories of that rest stop flooded back. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, hesitating before opening the bathroom door. The room was empty, but the mirror was fogged up as if someone had been in there, breathing heavily. In there, in the condensation, was a single word. "Why?" I backed out of the bathroom, my phone trembling in my hand. My mind raced. Why what? Why did I leave? Why didn't I stay? I didn't have answers, but one thing was clear, I wasn't imagining this. I decided to stay with a friend for a few nights, but the humming followed me there. The final straw came a week later when I found a pair of old, scuffed men's shoes on my kitchen floor. They were facing the wrong way. I packed a bag that night and drove to a motel hours away. As I sat in the room, trying to think of what to do next, I realized something that sent a fresh wave of dread through me. The shoes weren't there when I left my apartment. Who, or whatever, was tormenting me wasn't just leaving ominous signs. It had been in the car, with me. I don't know how to make it stop, or if it ever will. All I know is that every time I hear that faint humming or see a shadow move where it shouldn't, my heart skips a beat. And every time I close my eyes, I wonder if they'll be there when I open them. I couldn't just live like that, waiting for the next shoe to drop, literally and figuratively. figuratively. I needed answers. After another sleepless night in the motel, I decided to go back to where it all started, the rest stop. The thought made my skin crawl, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. Whatever this thing was, it clearly wasn't going to leave me alone until I faced it. I planned the trip carefully. I packed supplies, flashlights, a crowbar, even salt. I made sure to leave during the day and picked up a friend, Greg, who had a knack for debunking paranormal stuff. He thought the whole thing sounded like a bad dream, but he agreed to come along for the ride. By the time we arrived at the rest stop, it was dusk. The place looked just as eerie as I remembered, maybe worse. The flickery light in the parking lot was still there, as if it hadn't been fixed in years. Greg, always the skeptic, shrugged. Creepy vibe, sure, but you're probably just tired. Let's check it out. We walked inside, and the air immediately felt heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. The restroom was still dimly lit, the same damp smell lingering in the air. I half expected to hear humming the moment we stepped in, but it was silent. Too silent. Greg went to inspect the stalls while I stood near the sinks, heart pounding. There's nothing here, man, he called out. His voice echoed unnaturally, as if the room was larger than it should have been. Lebio. He stopped mid-sentence. Greg, I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I walked toward the stalls, gripping the crowbar in my hand. The door to the last stall was slightly ajar, and I could see Greg's feet inside, motionless. Greg, this isn't funny, I said, my throat tightening. I pushed the door open, and my stomach turned. Greg was standing on the toilet, his back to me, his head tilted at an impossible angle. His arms hung limply at his sides, and his body twitched like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. Before I could react, a low, guttural humming filled the room. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Greg turned slowly to face me, his eyes wide but lifeless. His mouth opened, and in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the crowbar. Greg, or whatever was controlling him, stepped down from the toilet, his movements jerky and unnatural. I turned to run, but the bathroom door slammed shut on its own. The lights flickered, and the humming grew louder, almost deafening. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. I screamed for Greg, but his body convulsed and collapsed to the floor. The shadows seemed to pull him toward the last stall, where they swallowed him whole. I don't remember how I got out of there. One moment I was in the restroom, and the next I was in my car, speeding down the interstate. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. Greg was gone. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. When I went to the police, they didn't believe me. They said the rest stop had been abandoned for years and no one had reported seeing another car there in a long time. The nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes I hear Greg's voice in my dreams, calling for help. Sometimes I hear the humming, soft but insistent, as if it's trying to draw me back. I know I'll never go back to that rest stop again. This happened about 5 years ago when I was visiting a traveling fairground with my younger sister, Ellie. We were in a smaller town at the time, the kind of place where events like this are a big deal. The fair had the usual attractions, bumper cars, fried food stands, and a slightly sketchy looking Ferris wheel. Ellie wanted to try everything, and since she was only 12 at the time, I kept a close eye on her. As the evening wore on, Ellie begged me to check out the maze of mirrors. I was hesitant. It looked like one of those cheap, tacky setups, but she wouldn't stop pestering me. I gave in and bought 2 tickets. The attraction was tucked into the back corner of the fair, away from the brighter rides and noisy games. The lights were dimmer here, and I noticed that not many people were lining up. The guy at the entrance, who I assumed was the operator, barely glanced at us as he took our tickets. He was tall, almost too tall, and his eyes didn't quite focus on anything as he muttered something about finding the exit. The moment we stepped inside, I knew something was off. The air was stale, and the mirrors were smudged with what looked like handprints and streaks of something darker. Ellie was giggling, running ahead, but I stayed close. The reflections distorted us, twisting our faces and bodies into strange, grotesque shapes. At first, it was funny, then it wasn't. Lily turned a corner, and I lost sight of her. I called her name, but the maze was disorienting, with every mirror reflecting me a dozen times over. The echoes made it hard to pinpoint where her voice was coming from. Lily, stop messing around, I shouted, trying to sound calm. Then I saw her, sort of. Her reflection was in one of the mirrors, her back to me. I sighed in relief and walked toward her, but something wasn't right. The way she was standing, completely still, didn't seem like her. She wasn't giggling anymore. Ellie, I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't respond, but her reflection moved. It turned to face me, but it wasn't Ellie. The figure had her clothes, her hair, but the face was wrong. It was smiling, way too wide, and the eyes were too big, almost bulging out of its head. I froze, unsure if it was some kind of warped reflection or a trick of the light. Then it raised a hand and waved at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Behind me, I heard Ellie's actual voice. She was calling for me, her voice panicked. "I'm here," I shouted, spinning around to follow her voice. But every time I turned a corner, I ended up back at the same mirror, staring at the not Ellie, who was now grinning ear to ear. Its lips moved, but the sound didn't match. It whispered something I couldn't make out, and then it started tapping on the glass. From the inside, at that moment, Ellie burst out of another corridor, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed my hand, and we ran. I don't know how we found the exit, but when we did, the operator was gone, and so were most of the fairgoers. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Ellie refused to go to any fairgrounds after that, and honestly, I don't blame her. For a while after that night, Ellie and I tried to put the experience behind us. She told me she barely remembered what happened inside the maze, just that she got lost and panicked. I didn't push her for details. It felt easier to pretend it was just a weird, one-time scare, but things didn't feel right at home. The first incident happened a week later. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in front of the bathroom mirror when I saw it. A handprint smeared faintly in the fog glass. It wasn't from me. I hadn't touched the mirror. The hand was smaller, like Ellie's, but it wasn't her. She'd already gone to bed. I told myself it was nothing. I cleaned the mirror and didn't mention it to anyone, but the next night, I noticed something else. My reflection wasn't quite in sync. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first. When I reached for my toothbrush, my reflection's hand hesitated just a fraction of a second too long before moving. I stared at it, unblinking, until I convinced myself I was overtired and imagining things. Ellie started acting strange, too. She'd been having nightmares, waking up crying and saying she'd seen the other me in her dreams. I'd hear her whispering to herself in her room, and when I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd just shrug and say, "No one." She avoided mirrors altogether, even covering the one in her room with a blanket. One night, about 3 weeks after the fair, things escalated. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling on my phone, when I heard Ellie scream from her bedroom. I bolted upstairs and found her curled up on her bed, staring at her covered mirror. She was here, she sobbed, pointing at the blanket. She was in the mirror, but she wasn't me. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I felt sick. I pulled the blanket off the mirror, half expecting to see something, but it was just us, just my reflection holding Ellie, both of us pale and shaken. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about our reflections looked off. That night, I stayed in Ellie's room. She fell asleep eventually, but I couldn't. Around 3 a.m., I caught movement in the mirror out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, and my blood ran cold. There were 2 Ellies in the reflection. One was sleeping peacefully in her bed, just like the real Ellie, but the other Ellie was standing behind me in the reflection, her head tilted slightly, her lips curled into that same too wide grin I'd seen in the maze. I didn't move. I didn't dare blink. The second Ellie stared at me, her grin widening as she slowly raised a hand to tap on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Ellie we needed to get rid of the mirror. She didn't argue. We took it out to the backyard and smashed it with a hammer. I hoped that would be the end of it, but I still feel like I'm being watched sometimes, like there's another version of me just waiting for the right moment. The worst part, a few days ago, Ellie showed me something she found under her bed, a shard of the broken mirror. I don't know how it got there. I threw it away immediately. A couple of days after Ellie found the shard, I started noticing it again, that eerie feeling of being watched. At first, it was subtle. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the bathroom mirror or in the reflection of the TV when it was turned off. Always fleeting, like the kind of thing you could convince yourself was just a trick of the light. But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. Then one night, it got worse. Ellie and I were eating dinner in the living room, watching some mindless reality show to distract ourselves. Everything felt almost normal for the first time in weeks, but as I glanced at the dark window behind the TV, my stomach dropped. There, in the reflection, I saw us. Except it wasn't us. The reflected version of me was staring directly at the window, not at the TV. And Ellie, she wasn't moving at all, just sitting there, her head slightly tilted, her mouth stretched into that same awful grin. I turned to look at her, panicked, but she was fine, happily munching on her food, completely oblivious. I turned back to the window. The reflection hadn't changed. Ellie, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm. Don't look at the window. Just get up. Go to your room. She frowned at me, confused. What? Why? Just go. My voice cracked, and she finally listened, hurrying upstairs. The moment she was out of sight, I grabbed the nearest blanket and threw it over the window, covering the reflection. My heart was racing, and I had no idea what to do. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the reflection, how it seemed separate from us, like it had its own awareness. I decided to do some research, hoping to find an explanation, something to make sense of this madness. I scoured the internet, reading about everything from urban legends to paranormal phenomena. Most of it felt like nonsense, but then I stumbled across an old forum post that made my blood run cold. The user described an experience eerily similar to mine, a visit to a traveling fairground, a strange maze of mirrors and unsettling encounters with distorted reflections afterward. The post ended with a warning, "Don't let them out." I couldn't sleep after reading that. What did it mean? Let who out? The reflections? Were they trying to escape? And if so, how? The answer came the next evening. Ellie and I were in our room, packing up anything with a reflective surface, mirrors, picture frames, even her tablet. I was determined to eliminate anything that could act as a window to whatever was stalking us. Suddenly, Ellie froze, staring at the small vanity mirror we'd overlooked. "She's here," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. "She's watching." I turned to the mirror, and there she was, Ellie's reflection, but not quite. Her eyes were too wide, and her movements didn't match Ellie's at all. She raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Then, slowly, the hand started to push through. "Rud," I screamed, grabbing Ellie's arm and yanking her out of the room. As we bolted down the hallway, I heard the sound of glass cracking and splintering behind us, followed by a faint, sickening giggle. We ran outside, not stopping until we were in the middle of the yard. I turned to look back at the house, half expecting to see something in the windows, but everything looked normal. Too normal. "What do we do?" Ellie whispered, clutching my arm. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't go back inside. Not until I figured out how to stop this. It's been 3 days. Ellie and I are staying at a motel for now, but I can't shake the feeling that we didn't leave it behind. Last night, I caught a glimpse of something in the motel bathroom mirror, a face, not mine, smiling at me. I think smashing the mirrors made it worse. It's not just confined to one reflection anymore. It's everywhere now. Windows, water, even the faint shine of polished surfaces. They're getting closer, and now Ellie's acting strange again. She's been whispering to herself the way she did before, but this time, when I asked who she was talking to, she didn't shrug it off. I worked part-time at a small, run-down mill in my town. Most of the shops were closing, and only a handful of stores were still open. My job was at a family-owned stationery shop on the first floor, tucked away in a corner. It was usually dead quiet after 7 p.m., which is when my shift would end. One night, my boss asked me to stay late to help organize some old inventory. I didn't mind. I needed the hours. Around 9 p.m., I realized I hadn't seen anyone walk past the store in almost an hour. The silence felt heavier than usual. I decided to take the trash out to the mall's dumpsters, which were located in the basement. This was a section of the mall most customers didn't even know existed. The elevator that led there was ancient and grown with every floor it passed. When the elevator doors opened, I was greeted by the dim glow of flickering fluorescent lights. The basement smelled damp, and the walls were lined with old posters advertising stores that hadn't been in the mall for decades. The dumpsters were in a wide, open area just outside a pair of heavy double doors that led to a maintenance corridor. I dragged the trash bag over to the dumpster and tossed it in. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the maintenance doors. I froze. It sounded like metal dragging against concrete. I told myself it was probably just a janitor or something and quickly headed back toward the elevator. Before I could press the button, I heard the scraping sound again, closer this time. It wasn't my imagination. It was rhythmic, like someone deliberately dragging something heavy. I turned around and stared at the double doors. One of them was slightly ajar now, though I could have sworn both were closed when I came down. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. Then I saw it. A pale, bony hand slowly slid through the gap in the door, followed by another. Whoever or whatever it was crawling. The hands were elongated, with fingers that looked unnaturally long. My instincts kicked in, and I jammed the elevator button repeatedly. The scraping turned into a faster, erratic clattering as the thing started pulling itself out of the doorway. I didn't stick around to get a better look. As soon as the elevator doors opened, I jumped inside and hit the button for the first floor. I could hear the sound of something dragging itself across the floor as the doors closed. My heart was racing, and when the elevator finally reached the top, I bolted out and locked up the store as fast as I could. I quit the next day. I didn't even go back for my paycheck. I don't know what was in that basement, and I don't want to know. After quitting, I did my best to forget about the whole experience. I told myself it was probably some maintenance worker pulling a prank or a trick of the light. You know, anything to make it seem less terrifying. But deep down, I knew better. A few weeks after I quit, I ran into a former coworker, Amber, at a coffee shop. She still worked at the mall but was planning to leave soon. I tried to keep the conversation light, but eventually she brought up the basement. "You ever notice anything weird down there?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes betraying unease. I froze. "What do you mean by weird?" Amber hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I had to close up alone the other night, and I went down to the basement to toss the trash. While I was down there, I swear I heard someone whispering my name, though when I looked around, no one was there." My stomach churned. I wanted to tell her everything but held back. Probably just her imagination. I said said weakly. Amber nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. Maybe. Still, I've been avoiding that place since. It just feels wrong down there. We said our goodbyes, and I left feeling even more unsettled. Amber's story confirmed what I had been trying to ignore. There was something wrong with that basement. A month later, I heard that the mall had shut down completely. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because no one else would have to deal with that basement. Dread because I wondered what they did with it. Did they seal it off? Did they check it out? Did they find anything? For a while, it was easy to put out of my mind. The mall faded from local memory like all dying malls do. But then, a year after it closed, I stumbled across a news article that stopped me cold. The article was about the mall's demolition. Construction crews had discovered something strange while tearing it down, a hidden room connected to the basement maintenance area. According to the report, the room contained old equipment, what looked like a makeshift living space, and bones, human bones. The article was vague about specifics, but it mentioned that investigators believed the remains were decades old. The most disturbing detail, there were scratch marks all over the walls and floors, as if someone or something had tried desperately to escape. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sound of that scrapey metal and the sight of those pale, unnatural hands. Whatever I saw that night wasn't just some prank or figment of my imagination. Sometimes, I wonder if the demolition really got rid of whatever was down there. What if it just moved, found somewhere new to hide? And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound, the faint, rhythmic scraping of metal against concrete. I hope it's just in my head. After reading that article, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't done with whatever had been in that basement. It lingered at the back of my mind, an itch I couldn't scratch. Weeks turned into months, and I started convincing myself it was over. Maybe I had just let my imagination get the better of me. Then, one night, I was driving home late from a friend's house. It was a quiet stretch of road, no other cars around, and my headlights barely cut through the dense fog that had rolled in. I almost missed it at first, a figure standing on the side of the road. It was hunched over, its back to me, barely visible in the mist. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was probably just some hitchhiker or someone walking home. As I got closer, I slowed down out of instinct, trying to get a better look. That's when it turned around. It wasn't human. The thing was gone, with pale, almost translucent skin stretched tightly over its face. Its eyes were hollow, deep black pits that seemed to suck the light from my headlights. And those hands, those long, bony fingers, I recognized them immediately. I slammed on the gas, my heart pounding as I sped past it. In my rearview mirror, I saw it start to move, dragging itself onto the road, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it tried to follow me. I didn't dare slow down. My car roared as I pushed it to its limit, the thing disappearing into the fog behind me. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in the corner of my room, shaking. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, but deep down, I knew the truth. It had found me. The days after that were strange. I started noticing things, small but unsettling. Footsteps outside my window at night, scratches on the siding of my house that hadn't been there before. Once, I found my front door unlocked even though I was sure I'd bolted it. And then came the whispers. It started as a faint sound I could barely hear, like wind rushing through the trees. But over time, the whispers grew louder. They came at night, calling my name with a raspy, broken voice. Sometimes it sounded like it was just outside my bedroom door. Other times, it seemed to come from inside the house. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That some pale, skeletal thing from an abandoned mall was haunting me. I knew how crazy it would sound. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I decided to search the house. I checked every room, every closet, under every bed. Nothing. But as I stood in the hallway, I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. The air grew heavy, and the whispers started again, louder this time. They weren't coming from inside the house. They were coming from beneath it. I live in an old house with a crawl space. I'd never been down there before, but at that moment, I knew I didn't have a choice. My hands were shaking as I pulled open the hatch. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, as I aimed my flashlight into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything, just dirt and cobwebs. But then, in the far corner, I saw them, handprints in the dirt. They were too large, too elongated to be human. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement, something pale and thin retreating into the shadows. I slammed the hatch shut and didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers didn't stop. They've never stopped. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. It's been weeks, and the thing is getting bolder. I see it out at the corner of my eye, standing at the edge of the woods behind my house. I hear it scraping against my walls at night, trying to get in. I don't think it's going to stop until it gets what it wants, and I have no idea what that is. I used to work at an amusement park. It wasn't one of those sprawling theme parks, but a local one with a mix of old, creaky rides and a few newer attractions. I was part of the maintenance team, working the night shift. My job was to inspect and repair the rides after the park closed. The incident happened about a year ago, but I still think about it every time I see a carnival or a Ferris wheel. That night, my supervisor told me to check out the water ride. It was one of those log flume rides with a fake mountain built around it. Guests would ride through dark tunnels, passing animatronic animals, before plunging down a steep drop into a splash pool. One of the animatronics wasn't functioning right. It was a bear that would pop out of the wall in one of the dark tunnels. Simple enough. I grabbed my tools and headed to the maintenance entrance at the back of the ride. The maintenance area was nothing like the fun, brightly lit part of the park. It was dark, cold, and smelled like stagnant water and grease. There were narrow walkways alongside the ride track and several access tunnels that twisted and turned through the structure. I climbed down a ladder into the tunnel where the bear was supposed to be. The lights down there were dim, and the only sound was the occasional drip of water echoing through the space. I found the animatronic. It looked fine on the surface, but when I opened the access panel, I saw that some of the wiring had been ripped apart, almost like something had clawed at it. I figured maybe a rat or raccoon had gotten in. That wasn't unusual, but as I worked to replace the wiring, I felt a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but the tunnel behind me was empty. I shook it off and kept working. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It sounded almost like an animal, but not quite. It was too deep, too guttural. My chest tightened, and I froze. Slowly, I turned toward the direction of the sound, shining my flashlight down the tunnel. The beam caught something moving, something big. It ducked out of sight behind a corner, but not before I got a glimpse. It wasn't a raccoon or a rat. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were reflective, glowing faintly in the flashlight beam like a predator's in the dark. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I scrambled back up the ladder as fast as I could, nearly slipping in my panic. As I reached the top, I slammed the access hatch shut and bolted it. I told my supervisor about what I saw, but he laughed it off, saying I must have imagined it. Maybe I would have believed him if it weren't for the scratches I saw the next day, long, deep gouges in the metal ladder and the walls of the tunnel. I quit that job not long after. The rumors about the ride didn't stop after I left, and they only got weirder. A few weeks after I quit, I got a message from one of my old coworkers, Aaron. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, not prone to making up stories or exaggerating. The text read, "Did you see this? The log ride is closed again. Manager's not saying why. Heard something happened to the new guy. He bolted mid-shift and hasn't come back. Something freaked him out. Thought you'd want to know." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the thing I saw in the tunnel, its glowing eyes, its skeletal frame. I tried telling myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But Aaron's text had shaken me. Someone else had clearly seen or experienced something down there. Curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I texted Aaron back and asked if he wanted to grab a beer. If anyone had the guts to poke around and figure out what was going on, it was him. We met up later that night at a dive bar not far from the park. Aaron looked rough, like he hadn't been sleeping much either. He leaned in close as we talked, keeping his voice low like he was afraid someone might overhear. "You remember that night you quit?" he asked. "The tunnel." I nodded. I didn't imagine it, Aaron. There was something down there. He exhaled sharply. "I know. I saw it too." Aaron told me that after I left, the animatronic repairs kept needing to be redone. Wiring ripped apart, panels smashed in. But it wasn't just the bear. Other parts of the ride were being wrecked in ways that didn't make sense, like something or someone was systematically tearing it apart from the inside. Then he dropped a bombshell. We got access to the old blueprints of the ride. The tunnels are bigger than we thought. There are sections that don't show up on the current plans, like hidden passages, and they go deep, way below the park's foundations, way deeper than that data bay. I stared at him, my stomach nodding. Why would they build something like that? Aaron shook his head. No clue, but some of those passages look ancient, like they were there before the park was built. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. "Have you been down there?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Once. We didn't go far. The deeper you go, the worse it gets. The air feels heavy, like it's hard to breathe. And it's not just the smell, it's this feeling, like you shouldn't be there." I didn't ask him what he meant by worse. I didn't want to know, but then he said something that made my blood run cold. "The thing you saw. I think it's not alone." Aaron went on to explain that he'd heard strange noises in the tunnels, scraping, whispering, and what sounded like muffled laughter. He said a few workers claimed to have seen shapes moving in the shadows, but no one stuck around long enough to confirm it. After that night, Aaron and I made a pact we'd stay out of it. Whatever was down there, it wasn't our problem anymore, but the park didn't let it go. A month later, I heard they'd shut down the log ride permanently me, claiming it wasn't worth the cost of repairs. They fenced off the area and started dismantling parts of the mountain, but I never heard if they finished. A few months after that, the park closed for good. Officially, it was due to declining attendance, but locals whispered that something else had happened. There were rumors of workers disappearing, strange accidents, and management refusing to answer questions. I've stayed away from the site ever since, but sometimes I can't help but wonder, did they bury whatever was down there, or did they just leave it behind, waiting for someone else to stumble across it? About a year after the park closed, I was scrolling through my phone one night when I came across a local urban exploration forum. I wasn't a part of that scene, but the title of one thread stopped me cold. Exploring the abandoned log ride at Pinecrest Amusement Park. Weird stuff found. The post was filled with grainy photos taken inside the dismantled log flume ride. Most of it was what you'd expect: graffiti-covered walls, rusted metal, and broken animatronics. But as I scrolled further, my unease grew. One photo showed what looked like claw marks etched deep into the concrete walls of the tunnel. Another showed a gaping hole on the floor, leading to a dark, seemingly endless drop. Then I got to the last photo. It was blurry, clearly taken in a panic, but the caption read, "Not sure what this was, but it was moving." The image showed a pale, humanoid figure crouched in the shadows. Its elongated limbs were unmistakable, as were its glowing, reflective eyes. The thread blew up with comments. Some people joked it was just a prank or a homeless person squatting in the tunnels. Others suggested it might be some kind of mutated animal. A few, though, were dead serious, claiming the tunnels were cursed or that something supernatural had been unleashed when the park was built. What really got to me, though, were the comments from people claiming to have worked at the park. One wrote, "This isn't the first time someone's seen that thing. Maintenance workers used to talk about it all the time, but management always told us to keep quiet." Another said, "I worked on that ride too. We always thought there was something wrong with the place. The lights would go out for no reason, and sometimes we'd hear voices when no one else was around. I'm not surprised it shut down." The thread stuck with me for days. I thought about reaching out to the poster, warning them not to go back, but I didn't. Maybe I was too scared they'd ask me for details I wasn't ready to revisit, or maybe I just didn't want to get involved again. About 2 weeks later, I saw another post on the same forum. This one was titled, "Urban Explorer Missing After Visit to Pinecrest Amusement Park." The post was a news article about a young man who disappeared after telling friends he planned to explore the old park. His car was found parked near the entrance, but there was no sign of him. Search teams combed the area but found nothing, no footprints, no clues, no trace of him at all. The forums exploded with speculation. Some people said he'd probably fallen into one of the holes in the tunnels and gotten stuck. Others thought he might have gotten lost in the underground passages and died of dehydration. But there were a few who hinted at something darker. One commenter wrote, "The park was built on cursed land. They say something was already there, buried deep, and the rides disturbed it. That's why they closed it down. Whatever they awakened, it doesn't like visitors." That comment stuck with me. It made me wonder if the thing I saw, and whatever else might have been down there, wasn't just some random anomaly. What if it had been waiting, dormant, until the park was built? What if tearing the rides down only made it angrier? I've stayed away from Pinecrest, but every now and then, I'll hear a story. The hiker will claim they saw strange lights near the old ride, or someone will report hearing screams echoing through the empty park. Most people dismiss it as urban legend or kids playing pranks, but I know better. I can't stop thinking about that last photo in the forum thread. The thing wasn't just hiding, it was watching, and the way it crouched, the way its glowing eyes stared straight into the camera lens. It wasn't scared, it was waiting. A few months ago, I was driving back from a wedding when my GPS rerouted me onto a smaller road. I wasn't in a hurry, so I decided to follow it. The route cut through some forested area, and after about 20 minutes, I passed a faded sign that read Maplewood Amusement Park. Closed for renovation. I'd never heard of it before, but something about the sign intrigued me. I've always loved theme parks, even run-down ones. Figuring I had time to kill, I decided to stop and take a look. The entrance gate was rusted, with vines creeping up its frame. Beyond it, the park looked almost frozen in time. Colorful signs faded by the sun, a carousel missing half its horses, and a Ferris wheel standing still against the gray sky. There was a strange quiet, like the world outside had been muted. As I wandered deeper into the park, I saw a roller coaster called the Thunderbolts. The track twisted wildly, its metal frame groaning in the wind. At the base of the ride, there was a small operator's booth, the glass cloudy with dirt. Furious, I peered inside. To my shock, there was someone in the booth. An older man sat hunched over the controls, wearing a faded uniform. His name tag was missing, and his hat obscured most of his face. Before I could say anything, he looked up, his eyes, watery and pale, locked onto mine. "You here for the ride?" he asked. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't used it in years. I laughed nervously. no, I was just exploring. The park's been closed for a while, right? He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and motioned to the roller coaster's car, which was sitting on the track like it was waiting for me. It's already best seat in the house. Something about his tone sent a shiver down my spine. I stammered an excuse about needing to leave, but he stepped out of the booth, blocking my path. His movements were jerky, unnatural. "You came all this way," he said, his grin revealing yellow teeth. "One ride would hurt." Against my better judgment, I climbed into the car. I thought maybe humoring him would make him let me go. As soon as I sat down, the safety bar slammed down on its own, trapping me in place. "Enjoy the ride," the operator croaked. His grin widened as he pulled the lever. The car lurched forward, and the ride began. At first, it was slow, the track creaking beneath me. But as we climbed the first hill, I noticed something odd. The sky darkened unnaturally fast, and the trees around the park blurred together. I swear I heard whispers, low, guttural voices, coming from the shadows. When the car reached the peak, it paused. Below, the park is gone. Instead, there was nothing, just a swirling black void. Then, the car dropped. I can't explain what happened next. It felt like I was falling forever, the voices growing louder and more frantic. Shadows reached out from the void, clawing at the car. The air was freezing, and I could barely breathe. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the car screeched to a stop. I was back at the platform. The operator was gone. The booth was empty, and the ride looked like it hadn't run in decades. The safety bar lifted, and I stumbled out, shaking. I didn't stick around to investigate. I ran back to my car and drove until I hit a main road. When I checked the GPS, the route to the amusement park had vanished. There was no record of Maplewood Amusement Park anywhere online. A week later, I started having nightmares. At first, they were vague flashes, dark tunnels, twisting tracks, and that void I saw beneath the roller coaster. But they kept getting worse. In one dream, I was back in the car, and the operator's face hovered inches from mine, his pale eyes glowing in the dark. "You never really left," he whispered. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. One morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, who might know about Maplewood Amusement Park. I posted on a local history forum, asking if anyone remembered it. Most replies were dead ends, people saying they'd never heard of it. But the one comment caught my attention. Maplewood, that place burned down in the 80 seconds. Freak accident on the Thunderbolts. They shut the whole park down after that. I felt a chill run through me. Burned out, the park didn't look new, but it certainly wasn't a pile of ashes when I was there. I replied, asking for more details, and the user sent me a link to an old news article. The headline read, "Fatal fire claims 8 lives at local amusement park." My stomach turned as I skimmed the article. According to the report, the fire started during an after-hours test of the roller coaster. The ride operator had stayed late that night to run maintenance. When the fire broke out, it spread so fast that the operator and a group of teenagers who had snuck in after dark didn't stand a chance. Their bodies were never recovered. There was a grainy black and white photo of the operator in the article. It was hard to make out, but the uniform and hat were unmistakable. My blood ran cold. It was him. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe I had somehow imagined the whole thing. But as I stared at the screen, something strange happened. The photo flickered for a moment, like an old TV screen losing signal. And then, I swear the operator looked directly at me. His lips curled into that same unnerving grin. I slammed my laptop shut and tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few days, little things started happening. I'd hear faint creaking sounds at night, like the groan of metal. The scent of burnt wood and singed hair would waft through my apartment out of nowhere. And the whispers. God, the whispers. They followed me everywhere, just low enough that I couldn't make out the words. The final straw came 2 nights ago. I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I never sleep with it open. When I sat up, I saw something on my dresser that hadn't been there before. It was a ticket. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the name was clear as day, Maplewood Amusement Park. Below that, in looping cursive, a read and meant one. I threw it in the trash, but the next morning, it was back on my dresser. Only this time, there was a date and time scrawled across the back. Tonight, midnight. I'm writing this now because I don't know what's going to happen when the clock strikes 12. The whispers have been getting louder, and every time I close my eyes, I see the roller coaster again, twisting into the void. I spent the day pacing my apartment, trying to convince myself not to go. I even thought about calling a friend, but what could I say? "Hey, I think a ghost roller coaster is stalking me, can you help?" No one would believe me. I barely believed it myself. As midnight approached, the air in my apartment grew heavy. The temperature dropped sharply, and the whispers turned into a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through my skull. When my phone chimed with an alert, I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was a calendar reminder I'd never set. "Your ride departs in 30 minutes. Don't be late." I tried ignoring it, but the hum grew louder. My walls started creaking, the sound eerily similar to the groan of the roller coaster tracks. Then, a faint melody floated floated through the air, the tinny, warped sound of a calliope. I couldn't breathe. It was the same music I'd heard at the park, playing from the broken carousel. Before I knew it, I was grabbing my car keys. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was like my body was moving on its own, a puppet to some unseen force. The ticket was still on my dresser, and against all logic, I slipped it into my pocket. The drive was a blur. My headlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness, and the GPS, which I hadn't even programmed, displayed a route to the park. My hands gripped the wheels so tightly they ached. I wanted to turn back, but my body refused to obey. When I arrived, the park looked even more decrepit than before. The gate was wide open, and the flickering glow of old string lights cast eerie shadows. The calliope music was louder now, distorted and discordant, like it was being played underwater. I stepped through the gate, and the air immediately felt thicker, heavier. The ticket burned in my pocket as I made my way to the Thunderbolt. It stood there, its skeletal frame looming against the night sky, lit by a strange, pale glow. The operator was waiting for me, right on time. He said, his grin as unsettling as ever. His uniform looked cleaner this time, almost new, and the faded hat now bore a pristine Maplewood logo. I don't want to do this, I said, my voice trembling. Please, just let me leave. You can't leave, he replied, tilting his head. Not until you finish the ride. The roller coaster car sat on the track, gleaming like it had been freshly polished. Against my will, my legs carried me toward it. The operator tipped his hat as I climbed in, and the safety bar slammed down with a force that knocked the wind out of me. As the car lurched forward, the operator waved, "See you on the other side." This time, the ride was different. The world around me blurred into a swirling void as the car sped up, faster and faster. Shadows crawled along the edges of my vision, twisting into grotesque shapes. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices screaming in languages I couldn't understand. The car plummeted, and I felt like I was being torn apart. The shadows reached out, clawing at my skin, my soul, pulling me deeper into the void. Just when I thought I would lose myself completely, the car came to an abrupt stop. I was back on the platform, the operator was gone, and the park was silent. I stumbled out of the car, my legs weak, and realized something was wrong. The world felt, the colors were muted, and the air was cold, heavy with the scent of burning wood. When I reached the gate, I saw my car, but it looked different. Older, dust covered, like it had been sitting there for decades. I climbed in, desperate to escape, but the keys wouldn't turn. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The operator was sitting in the back seat, his pale eyes glowing in the darkness. "You're part of the ride now," he whispered, his grin stretching impossibly wide. The last thing I remember was his laughter, echoing in my ears as everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting on a bench inside the park. The sun was rising, and everything looked crowded. Families were walking around, eating cotton candy and laughing. The park was alive, vibrant, as if nothing had ever happened. But when I tried to leave, I couldn't. Every path led me back to the Thunderbolt, and every time I saw it, the operator was there, tipping his hat and waiting. I've been here ever since. No one seems to notice me. No one answers when I scream. So, if you ever pass a sign for Maplewood Amusement Park, do yourself a favor, keep driving. Because once you're here, you're never leaving. It was late October, the kind of chilly evening where you could see your breath but not quite call it winter. I was driving home from my friend's house after a late night horror movie marathon. My route was mostly back roads, winding through a quiet stretch of forest. No streetlights, just the occasional reflective sign and the eerie glow of my headlights piercing through the dark. About halfway home, I saw something strange, a man standing on the side of the road. He was waving his arms frantically, trying to flag me down. He looked out of place, a large backpack slung over one shoulder, his clothes dirty and torn, and his face. Well, his face was pale, like he'd been out in the cold for hours. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. My mom's voice echoed in my head, "Don't pick up hitchhikers. You never know who you're dealing with." With something about this guy looked desperate, I reasoned that I could at least roll down my window and see if he needed help. I stopped the car a few feet ahead of him, keeping the engine running. He jogged up to my window, his breath visible in the cold air. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice shaking. "My car broke down a couple miles back. My phone's dead, and I just need a ride to the nearest gas station." There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted around like he was checking for something, or someone. "I'm sorry," I said cautiously. "I don't usually pick people up, but I can call someone for you if you want." His expression shifted in an instant. The polite desperation vanished, replaced by something harder to read. Anger, maybe. He leaned in closer to the window, and I instinctively locked the doors. "Come on," he said, his voice lower now. "I'm freezing out here. Just a quick ride. replied, "That's all I need." Alarm bells were ringing in my head. I shook my head and said, "Sorry, I can't," before putting the car in drive. As I started to pull away, he slammed his fist on the back window, shouting something I couldn't make out. My heart was racing as I sped down the road. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him running after me or another car following me, but the road stayed empty. About 10 minutes later, I reached a small gas station. Relieved, I pulled in and parked under the bright fluorescent lights. I was about to go inside to let the clerk know about the man when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Parked on the side of the lot, barely visible in the shadows, was a beat-up car, and leaning against it, staring directly at me, was the man I had just left on the side of the road. I didn't wait to find out how he'd gotten there or what he wanted. I backed out of the lot so fast my tires squealed and didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my driveway. I double-checked all my locks that night and slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow. The days after the encounter were uneasy, to say the least. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I rationalized it as paranoia. I double-checked my locks constantly, kept my curtains drawn, and made a habit of avoiding dark, isolated places. For a while, nothing unusual happened, and I started to convince myself it was just a creepy coincidence. But then, the note started. It began with a folded piece of paper left under my windshield wiper. I found it one morning as I was leaving for work. Written in smudged ink were 3 chilling words: "You drive fast." My stomach dropped. I looked around, scanning the quiet suburban street, but saw no one. Trying to shake it off, I tossed the note and drove to work. Maybe it was a prank, I told myself, someone messing around. But then, it happened again. 2 days later, another note appeared, this time taped to my front door. It read, "You shouldn't ignore people." My hands trembled as I held the paper and my chest felt tight. This wasn't a prank, someone knew where I lived. I called the police, but they weren't much help. Without a clear threat or evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested installing security cameras, which I did the very next day. I also told my closest friends about what was happening, and a couple of them offered to stay over for a few nights. For a while, the cameras and the extra company gave me a sense of security, but that didn't last long. One night, about a week after the second note, I woke up to the sound of a thud outside my bedroom window. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and quietly crept to the window. Peeking through the curtains, I couldn't see anything unusual, but I could feel someone or something out there. I opened the security app on my phone to check the camera feed. My blood ran cold. There he was, the man from the road. He was standing in my driveway, staring directly at the camera. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but I recognized him immediately. He didn't move. He just stood there, as if he knew I was watching him. I called 911, whispering into the phone as I kept my eyes glued to the screen. It felt like hours before I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The man finally moved, walking calmly out of view before the police arrived. They searched the area but found nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. The officers assured me they'd patrol the area for the next few nights, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't think he'd come back. But he did. The final straw came 2 nights later. I was lying in bed, trying to calm my nerves, when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security app, a new motion alert. I opened the app and nearly dropped my phone. The camera inside my living room, the one facing the front door, was recording. The door was slightly ajar, and standing just inside was the man. He looked directly at the camera, smiled, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then he stepped back and disappeared. I didn't wait to find out how he got in or what he wanted. I grabbed my keys, ran to my car, and drove straight to a friend's house. I never went back to that house alone. I filed a restraining order, hired a locksmith to change every lock, and eventually moved across the state. I don't know who he was or why he targeted me, but I still think about him sometimes. His pale face, his unnerving calm, the way he always seemed to be one step ahead. After I moved across the state, life slowly returned to normal. The fear that had consumed me began to fade, and I convinced myself that I was finally safe. The house I chose was in a busy neighborhood, with neighbors close by and a well-lit street. I installed an upgraded security system, complete with cameras inside and out. I even adopted a dog, a scrappy mutt named Max who barked at the slightest noise. For the first time in months, I felt secure. That peace lasted about a year. One chilly autumn evening, I was walking Max around the block. It was a quiet night, the kind where you could hear leaves crunching underfoot and the distant hum of cars on the main road. As we rounded the corner back toward my house, Max suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. I looked around but didn't see anything. "Come on, boy," I said, tugging his leash gently, but he wouldn't budge. Instead, he turned his head toward a nearby street lamp, his growl growing louder. And then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the light, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure. They stood motionless, watching us. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the stance, the shape of the backpack slung over one shoulder. It was him. I didn't wait. I yanked Max's leash and ran back to the house, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock unlock the door. Max barked wildly, his usual playful demeanor replaced by an almost feral aggression. I finally got the door open and slammed it shut behind me, locking it and every other lock in the house. My heart raced as I checked the camera feed. The front yard was empty, the street was empty. He was gone, as if he'd never been there. I called the police again, explaining the situation in shaky breaths. An officer arrived about 30 minutes later to take my statement and patrol the area. But just like before, there was no trace of him. The officer suggested it might have been someone passing through, maybe even a trick of the light. But I knew better. I spent the next few days on high alert, barely sleeping and jumping at every noise. My friends tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a coincidence or a case of mistaken identity. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I knew it was him. Then came the final message. One morning, I opened my door to let Max out into the fenced backyard. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something sitting on the steps. It was a small, folded piece of paper. My hand shook as I picked it up and unfolded it. Scrawled in the same smudged handwriting as before were the words, "Did you misspay?" I dropped the paper and ran inside, locking the door behind me. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my belongings, sold the house at a loss, and moved halfway across the country. This time, I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. To this day, I don't know how he found me or why he targeted me. I've changed my number, deleted all my social media, and live as anonymously as possible. Max is still with me, older now but just as loyal. Every so often, he'll bark at nothing and I'll feel that same chill run down my spine. I don't know if he's still out there, watching, waiting, but to the man who has haunted my life for years, let's never meet again. A few years ago, I was driving across the Midwest on a long solo road trip. It was late October and the weather had been unpredictable. 1 minute clear skies, the next, sudden bursts of rain. On this particular evening, I was on a lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but open fields and occasional clusters of trees. The sun was setting, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and orange. I was about an hour away from the next town when I saw him. A man, standing on the side of the road, his thumb out in the universal sign for "I need a ride." He looked rough, dirty clothes, a backpack slung over one shoulder, but not necessarily dangerous. I hesitated, thinking up hitchhikers wasn't something I'd ever done, but the next town was a long way off, and it was getting cold. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. He jogged up to my car, flashing a tired but grateful smile. "Thanks," he said as he climbed into the passenger seat. His voice was gravelly, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I just need to get to the next town." I nodded and kept driving, trying to make small talk to ease the awkwardness. He wasn't much of a conversationalist, giving one-word answers or vague responses. Something about him felt off, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something strange. He kept glancing at the glove compartment, almost like he was trying to decide whether to open it. I tried to ignore it, but my unease grew with each passing mile. "Do you live around here?" I asked, hoping to distract him. "Not really," he said, his eyes still darting to the glove box. I was starting to regret my decision when he suddenly leaned forward and pointed to a small rest area coming up. "Can we stop there for a second?" he asked. "I need to use the bathroom." I agreed, more because I wanted a moment to collect myself than out of any concern for his needs. As soon as I pulled into the parking lot, he grabbed his backpack and got out. He didn't head for the bathroom, though. Instead, he walked around the side of the building and disappeared from view. I waited for a minute, then two, but he didn't come back. My gut was screaming at me to leave, so I decided to check his seat. When I leaned over, I noticed something sticking out of the side pocket of his backpack, which he'd left behind. It was a knife. My heart raced as I realized how close I'd come to potentially being in serious danger. Without thinking twice, I jumped back into the driver's seat and sped out of there, leaving him and his knife behind. About an hour later, I reached the next town and pulled into a gas station. I called the local sheriff to report what had happened, and they sent someone to meet me. After hearing my story, the deputy's face grew serious. "We've had reports of a man matching that description attacking drivers on this stretch of highway." He said, "If you were lucky, he usually waits until they stop somewhere isolated." I never found out what happened to him, and honestly, I don't want to know. I just hope he never found another car to get into. A week after the incident, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every time I got into my car, I triple-checked the locks and scanned the backseat. My friends and family brushed it off, saying I was just rattled from the close call, but something about the whole experience stuck with me in a way I couldn't explain. Then came the phone call. It was a Friday night, and I was home alone, trying to distract myself with a movie. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I glanced at the screen. screen. The number was blocked. Normally, I'd ignore calls like that, but for some reason, I felt compelled to answer. "Hello," I said, my voice cautious. There was a pause. Then, a gravelly voice I instantly recognized. "You left something of mine." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to find my words. "Who is this?" "You know who," the voice replied. "You took off with my bag." That wasn't very nice. I was shaking now. How did he find me? My number wasn't listed, and I hadn't given him any personal information. "Leave me alone," I managed to say before hanging up. For the rest of the night, I sat in my living room with every light in the house turned on, jumping at every sound. I barely slept. The next morning, I went straight to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. Without a number or a name, they couldn't track him down. They suggested I change my locks, keep my phone number private, and stay alert. Over the next few days, things quieted down. No more calls, no strange encounters. I started to think maybe it was over. Then, one night, I came home to find a piece of paper taped to my front door. Written in messy, scrawled handwriting were the words, "You're lucky you drove off. Next time, you won't be." I felt the blood drain from my face as I looked around, but the street was empty. I tore the note down and called the police again, but once more, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to stay with a friend or family member for a while, which I did. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. Eventually, the calls and notes stopped, but I moved to a new city anyway, just to be safe. I don't know how he got my number or my address, but I don't want to think about what might have happened if I hadn't left the rest area when I did. Even now, years later, I still get nervous on long drives. I never stop for strangers, no matter how desperate they look. It's been years since I moved away, and life has finally started to feel normal again. I changed my name, cut ties with most of my social media, and stayed under the radar. No more long road trips, no more risky decisions. I thought I had left the nightmare behind, until last week. It started with something small, a feeling of being watched. I brushed it off at first. I told myself it was just residual paranoia from the past, but then I started noticing little things that didn't add up. A car parked across the street from my house for hours, the same car I'd seen near my work 2 days prior. A figure standing at the edge of the grocery store parking lot, just far enough away that I couldn't make out their face. And then the note. This time, it wasn't left on my door. It was slipped into the windshield wiper of my car while I was inside a coffee shop. I almost didn't notice it, but when I did, my stomach dropped. It was the same messy handwriting. "You thought you could run, but I've always known where you are." I stood there in the parking lot, frozen, the note crumpled in my shaking hands. He had found me again. That night, I called the police, but the officer who came by seemed skeptical. It could be a prank. He said, "Do you have any enemies or exes who might want to scare you?" I tried to explain the history, how this wasn't just someone messing with me, but without proof, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to patrol the neighborhood more frequently, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. Over the next few days, I felt like I was losing my mind. I started double bolting my doors, checking the windows every hour, jumping at every sound. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured him standing over my bed, knife in hand. The breaking point came 2 nights ago. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a faint noise. It was so subtle, I almost convinced myself it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, a soft scraping sound, like metal on wood. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from the back door. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the operator that someone was trying to break in. As I waited for the police, I armed myself with the closest thing I could find, a heavy lamp from the living room. The scraping stopped, and for a few agonizing minutes, there was silence. Then, a shadow moved past the kitchen window. I clutched the lamp tighter, ready to defend myself, but before anything happened, red and blue lights flooded my driveway. The police arrived just in time. They found footprints in the dirt near my back door and confirmed someone had been trying to jimmy the lock, but whoever it was had vanished into the night. I packed a bag that same night and haven't been back to my house since. I'm staying in a hotel for now, constantly looking over my shoulder. To the man who keeps finding me, wherever you are, I don't know what you want, but I'll do everything in my power to make sure we never meet again. This happened a few years ago, and to this day, I still can't explain what I saw, or rather, who I saw. It was the fall, just before Halloween, and my boyfriend at the time, Alex, and I decided to go for a drive in the countryside. There's something peaceful about cruising past endless fields of corn and pumpkins, especially when the weather is cool and crisp. We had no real destination in mind, just a tank full of gas and a playlist of spooky podcasts to keep us entertained. As the sun started to set, we realized we were pretty far from the main road. The paved streets had turned to gravel, level, and soon we were surrounded by tall cornfields on both sides. There wasn't a house or street light in sight. We were joking about how cliche it would be to break down in a place like this when Alex suddenly slowed the car. "What's that?" he said, pointing to the right. I followed his gaze, squinting through the golden light of the setting sun. At first, I didn't see anything, just rows of corn swaying in the wind. But then, I noticed it. A man was standing in the middle of the field. He was facing us, perfectly still, with his arms at his sides. He wore a dirty brown jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. I couldn't see his features, but something about his posture gave me the chills. He didn't look like a farmer or anyone who had a reason to be out there. Probably just a scarecrow, Alex said, laughing nervously. But even as he said it, I could tell he wasn't convinced. Neither was I. Scarecrows don't move. I whispered it, as if on cue. The man tilted his head slightly to the side. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to send my heart racing. "Drive," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Alex hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded and pressed the gas. We didn't look back. We drove for a few more miles in tense silence before we finally saw a sign pointing us back to the highway. Relief washed over me as we left the cornfields behind, and I convinced myself it was just some weird local playing a prank. That was until a few weeks later. I was scrolling through Facebook when a news story caught my eye. It was about a string of disappearances in rural areas near where we had been driving that night. The police had no leads, but witnesses reported seeing a man in a brown jacket and a wide-brimmed hat lurking near the fields. After seeing the news story, I couldn't shake the image of that man from my mind. The way he stood there, so still, yet so ominously alive, it haunted me. I told Alex about the article, hoping he'd brush it off and reassure me that it was just a coincidence. But his reaction only made things worse. "Do you think he was watching us?" he asked after a long pause. The question sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't thought about it that way, but the idea that he might have been standing there, waiting for someone to notice him, made my stomach turn. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was just a harmless eccentric. Maybe it really was some kind of prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. About a week later, I started hearing strange noises at night. At first, it was just little things, branches rustling against the window or the faint sound of footsteps outside. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, and I figured it was just animals or my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it got worse. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a tapping sound on the glass. My heart was pounding as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and far too human. I mustered the courage to pull back the curtain, but there was nothing there. Just the empty yard bathed in moonlight. I told myself it was probably a tree branch, even though I knew there weren't any near that window. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. They were large, too large to belong to anyone in my household, and they led straight to my window before disappearing back into the woods behind the house. I called Alex, freaking out, but he tried to calm me down. "It's probably just some kids messing around," he said. "They probably think it's funny," but it didn't feel funny. The following night, I stayed awake, determined to catch whoever it was. I sat by the window with my phone in hand, ready to call the police. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as I was about to give up, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him, the same dirty brown jacket, the same wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, didn't come closer. He just stood there, staring at the house. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his gaze. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. When the police arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area and found nothing except for those same large footprints leading to my window and back to the woods. They told me to keep my doors locked and call if I saw anything else, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. I stayed with Alex for a few days after that, too scared to be alone. But even at his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside the window made my heart race. Eventually, I moved out of that house and into an apartment in the city, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever, or whoever was out there. It's been years now, and I haven't seen him again. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that man in the cornfield. I think about how he stood there, waiting, watching, and I wonder, was I just unlucky enough to see him, or was I exactly who he was waiting for? Life in the city helped me regain a sense of normalcy, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't still glance over my shoulder or triple check the locks on my door every night. For a while, I even stopped watching true crime shows or reading anything remotely spooky. My nerves were shot, and I didn't want to feed the paranoia. Then, about 6 months after I moved, I got a letter. It came in a plain, unmarked envelope with no return address. My stomach dropped when I saw it because I hadn't given anyone my new address except close friends and family. At first, I told myself it was just junk mail, but when I opened it, I found a single piece of paper folded neatly in half. On the paper was a crudely drawn picture of a cornfield. In the middle of the field stood a figure in a wide-brimmed hat. There were no words, no signature, just the drawing. My hands were shaking as I held it, and I immediately felt like I couldn't breathe. I called the police, but they weren't much help. They said without a postmark or any identifying information, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I install a security system and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. That was it. For weeks, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that drawing. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain that if I looked out the window, I'd see him standing there. But nothing happened. No more letters, no strange noises, nothing. Eventually, I started to believe that maybe it was over, until I saw him again. I was walking home from work one evening, taking a shortcut through a quiet side street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. I was halfway down the block when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I stopped in my tracks and glanced around. The street was empty, or so I thought, and then I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the street, partially obscured by a lamppost. The same wide-brimmed hat, the same brown jacket. My blood ran cold. He wasn't moving, but I knew he saw me. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was inside my building, the door locked behind me. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. That was the last time I saw him, but the fear never left. Every time I walk alone, every time I hear an unexpected noise in the night, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to show himself again. To the man at the cornfield, who somehow found me even in the city, let's not mate. Ever. And if we do, I don't think I'll be the one running next time. I was in college at the time, working late nights at a diner to help pay my tuition. Most nights, I didn't leave until after midnight, and my apartment was a solid 20-minute drive from the diner. Usually, the drive home was uneventful, quiet roads, sleepy towns, but this night was different. It started with my car acting up. The check engine light had been on for weeks, but as a broke college student, I was hoping to put off repairs until my next paycheck. That night, as I pulled out of the diner parking lot, my car sputtered and stalled at a red light. I managed to restart it, but something about the way it sounded made me uneasy. I stopped at a 24-hour gas station about halfway home to grab a drink and calm my nerves. The station was mostly empty, except for a white van parked at the far end of the lot. I didn't think much of it at first. White vans are everywhere, right? I went inside, grabbed a soda, and chatted briefly with the cashier, an older man who seemed nice enough. When I walked back out, I noticed the van was now parked closer to my car. Again, I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out, I saw the van's headlights flicker on behind me. At this point, I started to get that sinking feeling in my stomach. The van stayed a few car lengths behind me as I drove down the main road. When I turned onto the quieter street leading to my apartment, it turned too. I thought maybe it was a coincidence, but then I decided to test it. I made an unnecessary left turn into a random residential neighborhood. Sure enough, the van followed me. Panic set in. I started running through my options. Should I call the police? Should I speed up and hope to lose them? My car, with its engine issues, wasn't exactly built for a high-speed chase. Instead, I decided to head for a well-lit grocery store parking lot that I knew had security cameras. As I pulled in, I parked right in front of the store and turned off my car. The van rolled slowly into the lot but didn't park. Instead, it crept along the row of cars, passing mine before stopping a few spaces down. I couldn't see the driver through the tinted windows, but I could feel their eyes on me. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. I grabbed my phone and pretended to call someone, hoping it would scare them off. A moment later, the van suddenly backed out of the space and sped out of the parking lot. I stayed parked there for another 20 minutes, too shaken to move. When I finally got home, I double-checked all my locks and slept with the lights on. The scariest part, the next morning, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. I hadn't seen it in the dark the night before. It was a crudely written note. "You're lucky you stopped." The note said to chill down my spine. I held it in my hand, staring at the words over and over as though they'd change if I looked hard enough. The handwriting was messy, almost childlike, and the letters were smudged. I couldn't figure out how long it had been there. Had they left it before I went into the store or after I got out? Either way, it was clear they had been watching me for longer than I realized. I threw the note away immediately, but the sense of being followed didn't leave me. That day, I told my roommate, Sarah, about what happened. She tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a weird coincidence or someone trying to mess with me. Still, she offered to come with me the next time I needed to make a late night drive, which was comforting. For a while, things went back to normal. I avoided late night shifts when I could, stuck to main roads, and kept my car locked at all times. I'd even scraped together enough money to get get my car fixed. I thought I was being paranoid, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. Weeks passed without incident, and I started to feel like maybe it was just a one-off creepy experience. Until it wasn't. About 2 months later, I got home from a late shift around midnight. As I walked up the stairs to my apartment, I noticed something on the floor near my door, a small, folded piece of paper. My heart dropped. It was the same kind of paper as before, and the same messy handwriting. You didn't see me this time. I froze. Someone had been outside my apartment, watching me. The thought made my skin crawl. How had they found me? Had they been following me this entire time? My hand shook as I unlocked the door and bolted it shut behind me. Sarah was already asleep, so I decided not to wake her. Instead, I stayed up all night, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I filed a police report. They took it seriously, but without any solid leads, there wasn't much they could do. The officer who came to our apartment suggested getting a security camera, which we did the very next day. I also started parking my car in a different spot each night, hoping to throw off whoever was watching me. For a while, the camera footage showed nothing unusual. I checked it obsessively every morning, half hoping and half dreading that I'd catch something. Then, about a week later, I found what I was looking for. At 3:17 a.m., the camera captured a figure walking slowly down the hallway outside of our apartment. They were wearing a hoodie, the hood pulled up so I couldn't see their face, and they stopped directly in front of our door. They stood there for almost a full minute before slipping something under the door and walking away. I didn't even want to pick up the paper, but I forced myself to. This time, it wasn't a note. It was a Polaroid photo of me. It looked like it had been taken through my car window, probably on one of those nights I'd worked late. The realization that they'd been close enough to take a photo made me feel sick. I showed the police the footage and the photo. This time, they took it very seriously. They increased patrols in my area and suggested I stay somewhere else for a while. Sarah and I ended up crashing at a friend's place for a few weeks, and I eventually moved out of that apartment entirely. I never found out who he was. The police said they didn't have enough evidence to track the person down, and as far as I know, they never caught them. To this day, I don't know if it was someone I knew, a random stalker, or something else entirely. I've since moved to a new city, changed my number, and been much more cautious about my surroundings. Even though I had moved cities and taken every precaution I could think of, the fear never really went away. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, scanning parking lots, and avoiding being alone in unfamiliar places. For months, I slept with a chair wedged under my new apartment door handle and a can of pepper spray within arm's reach. Things started to get better over time, though. I found a job in my new city that didn't require late night shifts, and I made a few friends who helped me feel more at ease. I even started dating someone, a guy named Ryan, who was patient with my paranoia and never made me feel silly for being extra cautious. I began to feel normal again, like the nightmare was finally behind me. Then, about a year after I'd moved, it happened again. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Ryan and I were at a local coffee shop. We picked a table near the back, tucked away from the busier seating areas. As we sipped our drinks and chatted, I noticed a man sitting alone at a table near the window. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, and he had a laptop open in front of him. Nothing about him screamed suspicious. If anything, he looked like he was just catching up on some work. But something about it made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off and focus on my conversation with Ryan, but every so often, I glanced toward the man. At one point, I swore I caught him looking at me, not a casual glance. This was different. He quickly looked back at his laptop, but it was enough to put me on edge. When we finished our drinks and got up to leave, I couldn't resist glancing back one more time. The man was staring directly at me now, his expression blank but intense. My stomach flipped. I grabbed Ryan's arm and whispered, "Let's go." We left the coffee shop, and I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. He was just a random guy. He probably wasn't even looking at me. But then, as we walked back to my car, I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned around and saw the man standing just outside the coffee shop door, staring after us. He didn't follow, but he didn't go back inside either. He just stood there, watching until we were out of sight. I told Ryan about what had happened, and he suggested we swing by the police station, just in case. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what I expected them to do. When we arrived, I described the man as best as I could and gave them the address of the coffee shop. The officer at the desk said they'd look into it, but reminded me that unless the man had done something illegal, there wasn't much they could do. The next morning, I found a familiar sight on my windshield, a piece of paper tucked neatly under the wiper blade. My hand shook as I unfolded it. The note was short and to the point. "I found you." I broke down crying in the middle of the parking lot. Ryan had to help me back into the apartment, where I called the police again. They came out to take another report, but just just like before, there wasn't much they could do. They recommended more security measures, but I could tell they didn't think they'd catch whoever was behind this. Since that day, I've been living in a constant state of anxiety. I changed my routines, switched my job again, and even moved to a new apartment with a more secure building. I don't go anywhere alone if I can help it, and I've become hyper aware of my surroundings. Ryan has been a rock through all of this, but I know it's taken a toll on him too. It's been a few months now, and I haven't had any new incidents. I want to believe it's over, that whoever this person is has given up or moved on, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. To the man in the coffee shop, or whoever has been following me all these years, please, for the sake of my sanity, let's not meet again. Ever. I was hiking alone on a popular mountain trail in late autumn. It was one of those crisp, perfect days where the air smells like pine and the leaves crunch satisfyingly underfoot. The trail I chose wasn't the busiest one. It veered off into a more secluded area about halfway up the mountain. I liked the solitude, and I was well prepared, plenty of water, snacks, and a map. I had done this hike before, so I wasn't worried. About 3 miles into the trail, I noticed something unusual. There were faint footprints in the dirt, heading in the same direction as me. They looked fresh, but I hadn't seen anyone ahead of me all day. I brushed it off. Maybe someone was moving quickly or had turned back before I arrived. As I continued, the atmosphere began to change. The woods, usually alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, felt eerily quiet. The further I walked, the heavier the silence became, pressing down like a weight. Then I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. Slowly, I turned, scanning the trail and the woods. There was no one there. I told myself it was probably just an animal and kept moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About half an hour later, I reached a clearing where the trail forked. I stopped to check my map when I heard it again. This time, the sound of deliberate footsteps crunching the leaves behind me. They were slow and methodical, like someone was trying to approach quietly. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but my gut screamed otherwise. I decided to take the fork that looped back toward the main trail. As I picked up my pace, the footsteps behind me quickened. They weren't far now. Whoever it was, they weren't even trying to hide anymore. I broke into a jog, my heart pounding as the footsteps got louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I could hear whoever it was breathing now, ragged and heavy, like they were right on my heels. Suddenly, I spotted another hiker ahead of me, a man in his 50 seconds with a bright red jacket. Without thinking, I sprinted toward him, shouting, "Hey, wait up." The man turned, startled. As I reached him, panting and wild-eyed. "Are you okay?" he asked. I glanced behind me. The footsteps had stopped. There was no one there. "I think someone's following me," I stammered, struggling to catch my breath. The man immediately became serious and stayed with me as we walked back to the main trail. He had a walking stick and seemed ready to use it if necessary. I kept looking over my shoulder, but we didn't see anyone the rest of the way down. When we reached the parking lot, I finally felt a sliver of relief. I thanked the man profusely and got into my car, locking the doors immediately. As I started to drive away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and froze. There, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. They didn't move, didn't wave. They just stood there, watching as I sped out of the lot. The following weeks were a blur of unease. Every time I left my house, I felt like someone was watching me. I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, I never actually saw the person again, but the feeling wouldn't go away. One night, about 2 weeks later, I was home alone. I live in a small house with a decent-sized yard, bordered by thick woods. It's peaceful, but suddenly that isolation didn't feel so comforting. It started around 9 p.m. I was watching TV when I heard a faint tapping sound at the back of the house. My heart sank. At first, I thought it was just a branch hitting the window in the wind, but when I muted the TV, the tapping continued. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I grabbed my phone and crept to the kitchen window, which faces the backyard. The blinds were closed, but there was a tiny gap between them. As I peeked out, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing just beyond the edge of the porch, partially obscured by the shadows. They weren't moving, but their posture was unsettling, rigid and tense, as if they were waiting for something. I stumbled back, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. The dispatcher was calm, assuring me that an officer would be sent immediately. I stayed on the line, crouched behind the counter, heart hammering in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of a car pulling into my driveway. I bolted to the front door and flung it open, relief flooding me when I saw the police officer stepping out of his vehicle. But when I tried to explain what had happened and led him to the backyard, the figure was gone. The officer shone his flashlight around, revealing footprints in the dirt, large ones leading from the edge of the woods to my porch. He followed them to where the figure had been standing and found something that made my stomach churn. There was a small knife, its blade stuck into the wooden railing of my porch, and a note tied to the handle. The officer carefully untied it and read it aloud. Next time, I won't just watch. I moved out of that house a week later, breaking my lease and relocating to a different state. It was an impulsive decision, but I didn't care. Whatever it took to feel safe again. After moving, things finally started to settle down. I found a new place in a small, busy neighborhood, a stark contrast to the quiet isolation of my old house. The streets were always alive with activity, and having people around made me feel safer. Slowly, I started to let my guard down, convincing myself that whatever happened back then was over. For the first few months, everything was fine. I got a new job, made some friends, and started to feel normal again. But then, one evening, I came home from work and found something that made my stomach drop. On my doorstep was a small, plain package with no return address. At first, I thought it might be a mistake, maybe something delivered to the wrong house. But when I opened it, my hands began to shake. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in messy handwriting. Found you. I felt like the walls were closing in around me. Hell, how could they have found me? I'd been so careful. I hadn't told anyone from my old life where I'd gone, and I hadn't even updated my social media. Panicking, I called the police again. They took the package and the note, promising to investigate, but I could tell they weren't optimistic about finding anything. After all, there were no fingerprints, no camera footage from my street, and no other leads. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside felt amplified, a car passing, a dog barking, the faint rustle of wind through the trees. I was terrified that I'd wake up to find that figure outside my window again. Over the next few weeks, strange things kept happening, small, almost imperceptible at first. My mail would go missing, even though I'd see the carrier drop it off. Lights in my house would flicker, though the electrician found nothing wrong. My neighbors mentioned seeing someone unfamiliar lingering near my house late at night, a tall figure wearing dark clothing, but they could never give a clear description. Then, one night, it escalated. I was in bed when I woke up to the sound of my front doorknob jiggling. My heart froze. Someone was trying to get inside. I grabbed my phone and quietly called 911, whispering to the dispatcher what was happening. The jiggling stopped, but then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, walking around to the back of the house. I stayed on the line, barely breathing, until I heard the sirens in the distance. The dispatcher assured me the officers were almost there. When the flashing red and blue lights finally lit up my street, I felt a wave of relief so strong I nearly cried. The police didn't find anyone, but they did find scratch marks on my back door as if someone had been trying to pry it open. That was the final straw. I packed my things and moved again, this time to a high-rise apartment with 24/7 security. It's been 3 years since then, and there haven't been any more incidents. I've tried to put it behind me, but I still feel uneasy whenever I'm alone. Every now and then, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if they're still out there, watching. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.